9 animals, one of Earth's most brutal deserts. 0 wild individuals of their species left anywhere on the planet. In 1982, conservationists in Oman load a small group of captive-bred Arabian oryx onto trucks and drive them into the Jiddat al-Harasis, a vast, scorched plateau where temperatures crack 50 degrees Celsius and rainfall is nearly non-existent. Scientists around the world call it reckless, some call it delusional. The oryx had been extinct in the wild for a full decade. There was no backup plan, no safety net, just 9 animals in a desert that kills. What happened next didn't just save a species, it rewrote everything we thought we knew about bringing life back from the edge. The Arabian oryx looks like it was designed by myth. Brilliant white coat, long straight horns rising from its skull like twin spears, built for a landscape that would destroy almost anything else. Seen from the side, those 2 horns overlap into one, and most historians believe that's exactly where the unicorn legend was born. For thousands of years, herds moved freely across the entire Arabian Peninsula. They were real, they were everywhere, and they were untouchable. Then came the 20th century. Motorized vehicles reached the Arabian desert, and everything changed. Hunters who once tracked oryx on foot or horseback could now chase them in trucks across open terrain. They didn't stand a chance. Through the 1960s, populations across Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, and Oman collapsed in sequence. Not slowly, but fast. Catastrophically fast. By 1972, the last known wild herd was gone. The Arabian oryx had become a ghost. The question was whether it would stay that way forever, or whether someone was willing to make a bet that most of the scientific world considered impossible. October 18th, 1972, a convoy of vehicles moves through the desert scrub of southern Oman. Armed men, organized, deliberate. They were not rangers, they were not researchers, and when they were done, the last known wild herd of Arabian oryx on the face of the earth had been wiped out. Some killed outright, some captured and taken. Not a single confirmed wild individual remained anywhere on the planet after that date. 1 species, 1 day, gone. The speed of what happened to the Arabian oryx is almost impossible to process when you lay it out as a timeline. At the turn of the 20th century, herds moved across the Arabian Peninsula in numbers that made the desert feel alive. Tens of thousands of animals ranging across Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, the Sinai, and Oman. They were built for that landscape. Wide hooves for sand, a metabolism that could extract moisture from the driest vegetation, a coat that reflected heat like polished bone. They had survived that desert for hundreds of thousands of years. Then came the 20th century, and it took less than 70 years to reduce them from a thriving population to nothing. The mechanism was straightforward and brutal. Motorized vehicles eliminated the oryx's primary survival strategy, which was distance. For millennia, a threatened herd could simply outrun a human hunter. They were fast, enduring, and the desert itself was their shield. But when hunters arrived in Land Rovers and later in trucks mounted with automatic weapons, that shield evaporated overnight. Hunting parties from wealthy Gulf states began organizing large-scale drives across the desert. A single expedition in 1962 was reported to have killed around 48 oryx in one outing. By the mid-1960s, sightings of wild herds had become rare enough that conservationists were already sounding alarms. By 1970, the estimates for remaining wild individuals had collapsed to somewhere between a few dozen and potentially fewer than 10. Then came October 1972. The International Union for Conservation of Nature formally listed the Arabian oryx as extinct in the wild shortly after. It became one of the first large mammals in modern history to receive that classification. Not a prehistoric extinction, not a gradual fading over centuries, a collapse so rapid that the scientific community struggled to categorize it properly. Thousands of animals to 0 in under 2 decades. The math is staggering when you sit with it. A species that had persisted through ice ages, through the rise and fall of civilizations, through every natural pressure the Arabian desert could produce, erased in roughly the same amount of time it takes a child to grow up and finish school. The question that conservationists faced after October 1972 was not a scientific one in the traditional sense. It was almost philosophical. When a wild population reaches 0, the concept of saving the species in the wild becomes meaningless. There is no wild population to protect. There is no habitat to manage. There is no behavior to preserve. What remained was a harder, stranger question. Did any Arabian oryx exist anywhere at all? And if they did, in zoos and private collections and royal enclosures scattered across the Gulf, Were there enough of them genetically to ever represent a real population again? Or were they just living relics, the last embers of something already finished? The answer to that question had actually been set in motion a decade earlier. While the wild herds were still dying, a small group of conservationists had already made a decision that most of their peers considered either visionary or completely futile. They had started collecting animals, not for display, not for research in the traditional sense. They were building something that would sit quietly in a desert city in Arizona for the next 2 decades, waiting for a moment that nobody was sure would ever come. Picture a zoo in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, in a city where summer temperatures regularly push past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, housing a small group of animals almost nobody outside of conservation circles had ever heard of. No fanfare, no major press coverage, just 9 Arabian oryx gathered from 3 separate sources living in carefully managed enclosures in Phoenix, Arizona. From the outside, it looked like an ordinary zoo exhibit. From the inside, it was the entire future of a species. The effort to collect those 9 animals began in 1962, 2 years before the wild population entered its final irreversible collapse. The operation was coordinated by the Fauna Preservation Society, now known as Fauna and Flora International, working alongside a coalition of zoos and wildlife organizations that understood what was coming. They identified 3 sources for the founding animals, 1 oryx from the London Zoo, 4 from the Wildfowl Trust in England, and 4 captured directly from the wild in Oman and Saudi Arabia. 9 animals total. That was the entire founding population of what the program formally named the World Herd. The name was not ceremonial. It was a statement of biological reality. Those 9 individuals did not represent a zoo exhibit. They represented the complete genetic legacy of a species. Every Arabian oryx that would ever live again, in any zoo, in any reserve, in any desert on Earth, would trace its ancestry back to that founding group. The Phoenix Zoo was chosen deliberately. Its desert climate, its institutional capacity, and its commitment to the program made it the logical anchor for what was, in essence, a genetic insurance policy written in living animals. Managing the genetics of a population that starts at 9 individuals is one of the most technically demanding challenges in conservation biology. The problem is not just numbers, it is diversity. When you breed from a founding group that small, every pairing decision either preserves or destroys a piece of the genetic variation the species will need to survive long term. The Phoenix Zoo's program tracked bloodlines with a precision that looked more like actuarial science than animal husbandry. Breeding was controlled, pairings were calculated. The goal was not simply to produce more oryx. It was to produce oryx that collectively carried as much of the original genetic breadth of the species as a 9-animal founding group could possibly sustain. By 1972, the year the last wild herd was destroyed in Oman, the world herd had grown to roughly 21 animals. By the mid-1970s, that number had climbed further, with additional animals held at partner institutions, including the San Diego Wild Animal Park and the Shaumari Wildlife Reserve in Jordan. The total captive population globally reached somewhere between 100 and 200 individuals by the late 1970s, spread across multiple facilities to reduce the catastrophic risk of disease or disaster wiping out the entire program in a single event. And then, slowly, a different kind of conversation started happening among the scientists and conservationists managing the program. The herd was large enough, stable enough, and genetically diverse enough that the question was no longer purely about survival in captivity. It was about something that had almost no precedent in the history of wildlife conservation at that scale. Taking an animal that had been extinct in the wild for nearly a decade, an animal that had been born and raised in enclosures, an animal that had never learned to find water in a desert or navigate a landscape without fences, and releasing it into one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The plan was audacious enough that serious scientists called it irresponsible. The desert they had chosen for the release was not just remote, it was the kind of place that tested the limits of what any living thing could endure, and the oryx going in had no idea what was waiting for them. The Jiddat al-Harasis does not look like a place where anything lives. It is a vast gravel plateau in the dead center of Oman. Flat, pale, and almost completely featureless. No trees, no visible water, just a horizon that stretches in every direction like the Earth forgot to put anything there. From the air, it looks like the surface of another planet. On the ground, it feels like standing inside a furnace that someone forgot to turn off. Summer temperatures on the Jiddat routinely exceed 50 degrees Celsius. That is 122 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of heat that warps metal, cracks rubber, and kills an unprotected human being within hours. Shade is essentially non-existent across the plateau. The gravel absorbs heat during the day and radiates it back at night, meaning there is almost no relief even after the sun goes down. Annual rainfall across the Jiddat typically falls below 30 millimeters. In some years, it barely registers at all. Put that in context, the Sahara Desert averages roughly 25 millimeters of rain per year. The Jiddat al-Harasis sits in that same brutal category, one of the driest inhabited places on the surface of the earth, and yet inhabited it is. The Harasis people have called this plateau home for generations. They are nomadic pastoralists, moving with their herds of camels and goats across a landscape that outsiders consider uninhabitable. They developed an intimate, generational knowledge of where water could be found after rare rains, which plants signaled moisture beneath the gravel, and how to read the desert's moods before the desert decided to kill you. Critically, the Harasis had also tracked wild Arabian oryx for as long as their oral history reached back. They knew the animal's behavior, its movement patterns, its seasonal routes. When the last wild herd was annihilated in 1972, the Harasis lost something they had lived alongside for centuries. This is the place the conservationists chose. And the critics were not quiet about what they thought of that decision. The central argument against the reintroduction was not logistical, it was biological. Captive-bred animals, the critics said, had been stripped of everything that made survival possible. The 9 oryx destined for the Jiddat had been born and raised in controlled enclosures at the Phoenix Zoo and other facilities. They had never experienced a predator. They had never had to search for water. They had never learned the difference between a plant that was safe and one that was toxic. Every calorie they had ever consumed had been provided for them. Every threat had been removed before they could encounter it. These were, in the bluntest terms, domesticated wild animals, and the plan was to drop them into one of the most hostile environments on Earth and expect them to survive. Ian Grimwood, one of the original architects of Operation Oryx back in 1962, had spent years thinking about exactly this problem. The counter-argument was not that the critics were wrong about the risks. It was that the alternative was extinction. A zoo-bred oryx with no survival instincts still had the genetics, the physiology, the digestive system, and the social structure of a wild animal. The instincts, the argument went, were not gone. They were dormant. The desert would wake them up, or it would not, and the program would fail. That was the gamble. 9 animals, one of the driest places on Earth, and a tribe of desert people whose knowledge might be the difference between success and catastrophe. The stage was set. The only thing left was the moment of release. Picture a cold January morning on the Jiddat al-Harasis. The gravel is pale and hard underfoot. The air is still, the sky a deep clear blue that only exists in places this far from any city. A small group of people stands near a set of transport crates. Inside those crates, 9 Arabian oryx wait, and the entire conservation world is watching what happens next. January 31st, 1982. The date is precise because every person involved understood they were standing at a hinge point in history. This was not a routine wildlife management operation. This was the first time in recorded history that a species declared extinct in the wild was being deliberately returned to its native habitat. The founding group numbered exactly 9 animals, 4 males and 5 females. Selected for genetic diversity from the world herd that had been maintained across multiple institutions, including the Phoenix Zoo, which had been the primary custodian of the breeding program since 1963. The operation behind that moment involved 4 distinct organizations working in coordination. Oman's government provided the territory, the political will, and the legal protection. The World Wildlife Fund contributed critical funding and international coordination. The Fauna Preservation Society, which had been involved since the original capture mission 2 decades earlier, provided institutional expertise, and the Phoenix Zoo supplied the animals and the captive breeding knowledge accumulated over nearly 20 years. Getting all 4 of those entities aligned, funded, and moving in the same direction had taken years of negotiation that almost collapsed more than once. But the decision that may have mattered most was not made in any boardroom. It was the decision to recruit the Harasis people as rangers and guardians of the reintroduction zone. This was not a symbolic gesture. The Harasis brought something no outside scientist could replicate. A living, generational map of the Jiddat encoded in memory and practice. They knew where water pooled after rain, sometimes just below the surface, invisible to anyone who had not grown up reading that specific landscape. They knew the movement patterns of the few other animals that survived out there. They knew the plateau's rhythms across seasons and years. 14 Harasis men were formally recruited as wildlife rangers, given vehicles, radios, and a mandate to protect the oryx from the one threat the desert itself could not be blamed for: humans with guns. The timing of the release was not accidental. January sits in Oman's cooler winter months, when daytime temperatures on the Jiddat dropped to a range the oryx could manage without immediately succumbing to heat stress. The team had roughly 4 to 5 months before the plateau turned into the furnace it became every summer. That window was the oryx's best chance to begin learning the landscape, finding food, and establishing the behavioral patterns they would need to survive the heat season. Every animal carried a radio collar. Observers tracked movements on the ground and logged data daily. The scientific community had invested enough skepticism in this project that the documentation had to be airtight. If the animals died, the data would explain why. If they survived, the data would explain how. Either way, the record had to be complete. The 9 oryx walked out of their crates and onto the gravel of the Jiddat al-Harasis. They stood still for a moment, the way animals do when a new world opens up around them. Then they began to move. What the desert did to them over the months that followed would either validate 20 years of work or prove every skeptic exactly right. Within weeks, something extraordinary began to happen. The 9 oryx didn't wander aimlessly. They moved with purpose, spreading out across the gravel plains in long, deliberate arcs, covering distances that stunned the Harasis rangers watching from a distance. These animals had never lived in a desert. They were born in zoo enclosures in Phoenix, Arizona, and yet they navigated the Jiddat al-Harasis as though they had a map drawn somewhere deep inside them. That's exactly what they have. Arabian oryx carry behavioral memory encoded over hundreds of thousands of years of desert survival. Captivity can suppress those instincts, but it cannot erase them. Given the right environment, the right pressure, the right silence, they surface again, sometimes within days. The oryx located sparse vegetation that the rangers themselves had difficulty spotting. They found seasonal drainage lines where moisture lingered just below the surface. The midday temperature spiked past 50 degrees Celsius. The herd clustered together in tight formation, each animal angling its body to cast shade onto the one beside it. This is a documented wild behavior, a living thermal shield, the herd becoming its own shelter. Nobody taught them to do it. Nobody could have. They simply remembered. By 1984, less than 2 years after release, the first calves were born on Omani soil, wild-born Arabian oryx, for the first time in over a decade. The rangers recorded the births with the kind of careful, almost reverent documentation that people use when they know they are watching history happen. Each calf represented something the entire project had gambled on, that the instinct to survive, to breed, to belong to a landscape could survive captivity intact. It had. Harasis rangers, men who had spent their entire lives reading the desert, reported something that doesn't appear in scientific literature but carries its own weight. They said the oryx moved through the Jiddat as if they had never left, not like animals adapting to a foreign place, like animals returning to one they already knew. 20 years of careful breeding, meticulous record keeping, and one audacious release had produced something that shouldn't have been possible. A ghost had come back to life, but the desert wasn't the only thing waiting for them. By the early 1990s, the wild herd had grown to over 400 individuals. It was one of the most remarkable conservation recoveries ever recorded, proof that extinction, under the right conditions, could be reversed. Then the poachers arrived, organized, connected, ruthless. Live oryx were being captured and sold to private collectors across the Gulf as living status symbols. And by 1999, the wild population had collapsed to somewhere between 28 and 100 animals, depending on which estimate you trust. Every single one of them was a disaster. Oman now faced the same impossible question the project had started with, only in reverse. Pull the survivors back into captivity and admit the wild had failed them, or hold the line and risk losing everything again. They held the line. Rangers gained real authority. Satellite tracking replaced guesswork. Breeding moved onto Omani soil. International pressure targeted illegal collections across the Gulf. The near collapse became the curriculum, the exact blueprint for what reintroduction programs worldwide now study when success starts eating itself alive. Subscribe to see which species gets that second chance next.